The death certificate for the unknown child, OME number 57-0863, would be amended to reflect the child's birth name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli.
On February 25, 1957, a cold morning in Philadelphia, a college student walked through a wooded field near Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was just taking a walk through the countryside, the kind of walk you could still take back then, before the suburbs sprawled and the fields turned into houses. He found a cardboard box. Not an unusual thing to find in the woods, but something made him look inside. What he saw stopped him cold. A small body, a young boy, naked, wrapped in a faded plaid blanket covered in bruises. The body had been there for 2, maybe 3 days. The coroner would later determine he'd been beaten. Hit in the head repeatedly. The violence was thorough and absolute. But the real mystery wasn't the how, it was the who. Nobody knew who this child was. The boy was brought to the coroner's office. He was estimated to be between 4 and 6 years old. He weighed only 30 pounds. He was about 3 feet tall. He had a crude, uneven haircut. His hair was dark. His body bore the marks of neglect and violence in equal measure. He was malnourished. He was small. He was nobody's child, or rather, he was someone's child, but nobody alive seemed willing to claim him. Philadelphia police knew they had a problem on their hands. In 1957, a murdered child should have generated immediate leads. Parents should have reported a missing boy. Someone should have recognized him. But the case would stumble from that first moment and never find its footing for the next 65 years. That very week, Philadelphia launched what the newspapers called the greatest circulation campaigns in the city's history. It sounds quaint now, but it was their way of fighting back against anonymity. The police distributed 4,000 circulars to every physician in Philadelphia. They sent 10,000 more to police departments across Pennsylvania and the eastern states. A few days later, they prepared 25,000 additional circulars. Then came the big push. 300,000 flyers were sent out in utility bills, Philadelphia Gas Works, and Philadelphia Electric Company envelopes. Every household in the city would know about the boy in the box. The Philadelphia Inquirer printed 400,000 copies of a photo. Post offices were papered with his image. Police stations displayed his likeness. Newspapers ran front-page stories. The boy's face was everywhere, and yet nobody came forward. They found clues at the scene. A blue corduroy cap with a leather strap. The blanket he was wrapped in, faded plaid worn thin. The box itself was significant. A large J-penny bassinet box. Someone had bought a baby bed. Someone had placed this dead child inside it. The cap was traced to a shop in South Philadelphia. The owner remembered selling it. He said the buyer was a man between 26 and 30 years old. But the man was never found. He disappeared into the past as completely as the boy would remain lost in it. Throughout 1957 and into 1958, the police pursued hundreds of leads. By April 1957, just 2 months after the boy was found, more than 50 people from outside Philadelphia and 85 city residents had come forward with identifications. The police received 500 letters. They tracked down leads in Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Ohio. They questioned suspects. They followed rumors. They chased ghosts. A Colorado woman was investigated. She had been accused of dumping her own daughter's body and matched a description of someone seen near Fox Chase around the time of the boy's death. A Carnival family was looked at. They had traveled the eastern states and were implicated in child abuse cases. A man named Edward Pozovac was detained and questioned in Nashville, Tennessee. He was carrying a news clipping about the unidentified boy. He took a lie detector test. Results were negative. None of it led anywhere. But there was something investigators didn't know. Something that would keep them searching, unsuccessfully, for more than 6 decades. The boy had a name. He was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was born on January 13, 1953. He was 4 years old when he died. His mother existed somewhere, and so did his father. He had siblings. He had a place in a family tree that was out there in the world waiting to be discovered. But in 1957, with no databases, no DNA, no way to connect the dots across state lines and family histories, Joseph Zarelli might as well have been a ghost. The Philadelphia police did everything they could think of with the tools they had. And it wasn't enough. The case grew cold. The boy was buried in the city cemetery. Potter's Field, later moved to Ivy Hill Cemetery in Mount Airy. A headstone was placed. It read, America's Unknown Child. That name would define him for the next 65 years. Not Joseph Augustus Zarelli, age 4, just America's Unknown Child. A monument to a mystery that Philadelphia could never solve. Years passed. Decades passed. Still nothing. In the early 1960s, the case remained active, but the intensity faded. New murders took priority. Other children went missing. The Boy in the Box became Philadelphia's most famous cold case, which meant everyone knew about him, and no one could do anything about him. He existed in a strange limbo, famous but unknown, mourned but unclaimed. The 1970s came and went, then the 1980s. Occasionally a tip would arrive, a supposed witness, a deathbed confession that led nowhere. A woman who claimed her mother had purchased the child from human traffickers and beat him to death. But all the leads amounted to the same thing, nothing. The case had so much attention that it attracted noise, theories, speculation, wild guesses, but it generated no answers. In 1998, 41 years after the boy was found, the case received a sudden burst of national attention. The television show America's Most Wanted featured the Boy in the Box. The publicity generated about 60 new tips. Philadelphia police and the national media community held their breath. Could this be it? Could national television do what local investigation could not? Again, nothing productive emerged. But something significant happened that same year. Police obtained permission to exhume the boy's body for DNA testing. This was the moment when science finally caught up to the mystery. The DNA was extracted. A profile was created. But when it was entered into the databases available at the time, there were no matches, no hits. The genetic information existed, but there was no way to connect it to a living person. This is the tragedy of early DNA technology. It promised answers but delivered only fragments. The boy's DNA was in a vault, waiting for a future that hadn't yet arrived. Decades continued to blur together. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. Philadelphia's oldest unsolved homicide remained unsolved. There was a $20,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. The boy's grave was tended. His case was never officially closed, but it wasn't advancing either. It was frozen in place. Then in 2018, something changed. Forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a new science. It was a paradigm shift. Instead of matching DNA to convicted criminals in a database, investigators could now match a victim's DNA to living relatives through ancestry databases. When someone uploads their DNA to Ancestry.com or 23andMe or other genealogy sites, they're not just learning about their own heritage. They're creating a genetic fingerprint that can match to distant cousins, half-siblings, grandparents. Millions of people were voluntarily creating a map of American family relationships. This was the breakthrough that would finally matter. In 2019, 62 years after the boy was found, police obtained a new court order to exhume his body again. This time, the goal was different. They needed better DNA. They needed more of it. They needed enough genetic information to enter into the new genealogy databases that had become available in the intervening years. The remains were carefully examined. DNA was extracted, but here's where the science becomes difficult. The boy's body had been in the ground for 6 decades. The DNA was degraded. It was fractured into tiny pieces. According to Colleen Fitzpatrick, the president of Identifinders International, the genetic material looked like confetti and was basically shot. Fitzpatrick is a forensic scientist and genealogist who had founded the DNA Doe Project, an organization dedicated to identifying unidentified remains using genetic genealogy. She's worked on some of the most difficult cases in the country. But even for her, the boy in the box represented an extraordinary challenge. This was the most challenging case of my career, she would later say. It took 2.5 years. 2.5 years of painstaking work, reconstructing degraded DNA like someone trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces are missing. Her team worked on stitching the fragments together, building what's called SNP data, pieces of genetic information that could be used for genealogy. It was like trying to read a book that had been burned page by page, fragment by fragment, hoping the words would eventually make sense. In the spring of 2021, after all those months of work, Fitzpatrick and her team finally had something usable. They uploaded Joseph Zarelli's genetic profile to GEDmatch, a genealogy database, and then they waited to see if the universe would answer. Nobody had any idea what they were about to find. Misty Gillis was a forensic genetic genealogist working with Identifinders International. She was assigned to the boy in the box case. Gillis had gotten into genealogy in a deeply personal way. In her late 20s, as genetic testing evolved, she had her father take a DNA test. Using the results, she identified her grandfather's father, someone she'd never known existed. Once I did that, she said, I was absolutely hooked. Now she was given the task of using Joseph Zarelli's degraded DNA to build a family tree out of thin air. The genealogy databases returned matches, third and fourth cousins on Joseph's mother's side. People who were distantly related, close enough to share measurable DNA, far enough removed that they were difficult to trace. Gillis began the methodical work that genetic genealogists do. She looked at where the matches married into each other. She built out their family trees. She saw where the branches connected and reconnected. Like the Sudoku puzzle that Fitzpatrick had described, Gillis began to find the logic in the patterns. By fall of 2021, the picture became clear. The branches of the family tree narrowed and pointed to a single individual, Joseph's mother, the woman who had given birth to him in 1953, who had held him as an infant, who had then vanished from his life, whether by death, separation, or loss, leaving him alone in the world. When Misty Gillis confirmed Joseph's identity, she cried. I cried for about 3 days straight, she later said, because I felt like I could finally grieve him. She had been walking alongside Joseph silently for months, working to give him back his name. When she found it, when the mystery finally resolved, she felt as if she could finally mourn him. When I work these cases, she explained, it's like you're walking alongside the person silently. It was really emotional for me, but it was closure in a sense. I take these kids on as if they are my surrogate children. The information was handed to Philadelphia police. Detectives tracked down records. They confirmed the mother's identity through birth certificates and official records. They contacted living maternal relatives. Donna Thomas, a cousin, provided a DNA sample that the genealogists used to confirm Joseph's identity and link him to his biological father. Joseph Augustus Zarelli had a family. He had always had a family. But nobody had known how to find them until science caught up to grief. On December 8, 2022, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw stood before the cameras and said 6 words that would echo across the city and the nation. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. 65 years. Nearly 7 decades. The boy in the cardboard box finally had a name. America's unknown child was unknown no longer. Police provided the details at a press conference. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born on January 13, 1953. He was 4 years old when he was found. He had living siblings. His parents were both deceased, and out of respect for the family, police would not release their names publicly. The identity had been confirmed through DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. The case, while solved in terms of the boy's identity, remained open as a homicide investigation. Police had suspicions about who was responsible for his death, according to Captain Jason Smith, but they would not speculate publicly about an active investigation. The truth, which would emerge gradually, was that investigators believed family members may have been involved in the boy's death. But without clear evidence and with the passage of time, a prosecution seemed unlikely. The case would remain officially unsolved in terms of justice. What mattered on that day in December was simpler and more profound. The boy had been found. Not found alive, of course. Found in the most tragic way imaginable decades earlier. But found nonetheless, identified, named, claimed. His headstone was changed. The grave at Ivy Hill Cemetery that had read America's unknown child now bore his real name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Flowers were placed there. People came to mourn him as a person, not as a symbol. A family that hadn't known his fate for generations finally knew where he was and could grieve him properly. The forensic genealogists who worked on the case spoke about what they'd accomplished. Colleen Fitzpatrick emphasized that the breakthrough had been a cooperation among experts from several countries. It wasn't one person or one laboratory. It was a network of scientists, genealogists, and detectives all working toward a single goal, giving Joseph Zarelli his identity back. For many of the genealogists involved, the work had a profound emotional weight. Misty Gillis spoke about how she'd approached these cases, treating each unknown victim as if they were her own child. I take these kids on as if they are my surrogate children, she said. For her, finding Joseph's name wasn't just solving a puzzle. It was a kind of closure, a chance to finally grieve someone she'd never met, but had come to care deeply about. The technology that finally solved the case, forensic genetic genealogy, had only become mainstream in the last 5 years or so. It was developed after the boy in the box's initial DNA profile was created in 1998. It depended on millions of people voluntarily uploading their DNA to ancestry sites. It required new algorithms and databases. It took the combined knowledge of genealogists, forensic scientists, and detectives working across state lines and even across countries. But the core of it was beautifully simple. Joseph Zarelli had relatives. Somewhere out in the world, people carried his genetic material in their own bodies. They just didn't know it. When those relatives uploaded their DNA to genealogy sites out of curiosity about their own heritage, they inadvertently created a path back to a 4-year-old boy found dead in 1957. One distant cousin's decision to take a DNA test eventually led to the identification of a murdered child 6 decades later. In the aftermath of the identification, questions remained. The most important question, who killed Joseph Zarelli and why, was never fully answered in a court of law. The investigation remained active. Police spoke about suspicions but never filed charges. In a way, this is the unresolved tragedy at the heart of the story. The boy got his name back, but his killer never faced justice. His death remains one of Philadelphia's oldest unsolved murders. But there was meaning in the identification itself. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was not forgotten. He was not an eternal mystery. He was a real child who had lived 4 years, who had a family, who had mattered to people even if those people never got to know him. In 2024, his grave was re-landscaped. A new headstone was placed, engraved with his name. In a city that had been haunted by his anonymity for 65 years, Joseph Zarelli finally came home. The case also changed how police departments across the country approached cold cases involving unidentified remains. If degraded DNA could eventually be reconstructed and matched through genealogy, then no victim had to remain unknown forever. It was a lesson taught by a small boy in a cardboard box, preserved in a grave in Philadelphia, finally speaking his name across the decades. The boy in the box had a name. He was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He lived for 4 years. He was beaten to death. He was placed in a cardboard box and left in the woods. For 65 years, Philadelphia mourned him as a mystery. Now finally they could mourn him as a person. That was the breakthrough. That was what 2.5 years of painstaking DNA reconstruction, thousands of hours of genealogical research, and the cooperation of experts across multiple countries had made possible. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, age 4, finally came home.